President, I rise today to discuss the bill that's on the floor, and the very fact that we have this bill on the floor, I think, deserves some attention. We have an appropriations bill on the energy and water responsibilities of the federal government. I think this is the first time this bill's been on the Senate floor in 7 years, and the Appropriating Committee, with the current majority, is a month ahead of any time in recent history to mark bills up and get them to the floor. The majority leaders set aside 12 weeks to do the work that for decades, and in fact for a couple of centuries, was the core work of what the Congress did. The Congress set the priorities of the country by having an open and free debate on how the Congress and the country would spend the money that was entrusted to the Congress. The long-ranging discussion of the power of the purse. You don't have to be a great student of American history to say, well, don't you men and women in the Congress have the power of the purse? Well, we do have, according to the Constitution, but we haven't had in the practice of the last 6 or 7 years, when the work of the Congress just simply was not done in a way that people could see what was going on or that members could freely weigh in. One of the things about the debate we're having on this energy and water bill is any member of the Congress, any member of the Senate rather, can come to the floor and they can say, don't spend this money at all. They can say, in this bill, spend the money here rather than here. They can say some combination of those two things, and then the Senate votes on that before we approve the final bill. So I'm pleased that we're debating this bill. That may actually be more important than the bill itself, but the bill itself is important as well. This bill provides the critical resources to support the safety and long-term viability of our waterway systems. You know, one of the reasons we're so competitive internationally and so competitive in our own domestic economy is we've had the ability to use the waterways of the country, particularly the internal as well as the external waterways, in a way that makes us more competitive than we'd be otherwise. Our inland waterways in particular are critical to economic growth. We're right on the edge of a time when world food demand doubles from your state, Mr. President, from my state. Agriculture, the biggest economic sector of the economy, is in a great position to not only meet those food needs in our country, but to meet food needs worldwide. And that position is dramatically enhanced if we have a transportation system that doesn't just include highways and doesn't just include railroads, but also includes the waterways of the country. Another thing that our two states have had in common, the upper Missouri and the lower Missouri, is the devastating challenges that flooding can present. And this bill makes it possible for us to deal with flood control and navigation, and once again emphasizes that the Corps of Engineers can't just say those are the top two priorities of managing the Mississippi River Valley system, particularly the Missouri and Mississippi, but those really need to be apparent in their commitment to both flood control and navigation as things we want to do. I'm pleased this bill prioritizes things like the bank stabilization and navigation project on the Mississippi River, the tributaries project that is central to our flood control efforts in our state. I'm also glad the bill increases funding for small ports and harbors to serve as a vital place for us to compete. You know, the inland ports are basically export ports. And Mr. President, there's nothing wrong with buying things from other people, but it's better to sell things to other people. The inland ports serve a geographic area that's roughly twice as big as the coastal ports. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the coastal ports. It just means let's get realistic here about where we're making investments that allow us to compete. You know, if a coastal port effectively really supports an area, say 300 miles inland from that coastal port, an inland port supports an area 300 miles in all directions. And so this is an effective thing for us to do. Also, we need to ensure that we're looking at our systems, our port systems, as a system, not just as one individual port. And the old days of the Congress being able to say, this is what you want to do in this report, in this port or this harbor, are now being replaced by being sure that the Corps of Engineers understands its responsibility to do this. Now, another agency, Mr. Speaker, that we need to have understand its reasonable responsibility is the EPA. And so once again, I'm on the floor for the third time in about as many months, and heaven knows how many times in the last several years, talking about this incredible overreach that the EPA is making when they want to decide that they don't want to change the law that says navigable waters of the United States are under the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency, not a new concept in law at all. Navigable waters have seemed to be a federal responsibility since the 1840s in law, in bills that have passed the Congress. And so in the early 1970s, the Clean Water Act was passed, the EPA was formed, and the Clean Water Act said the EPA will have jurisdiction over navigable waters. But with this outrageous waters of the U.S. rule, the EPA wants to now define navigable waters as all the water basically in the country, because they want to say it's any water that can run into any water, that can run into any water, that can, I don't know how many iterations of that there would be, that can run into any water that eventually runs into navigable water. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now where the EPA is challenging a company in Minnesota based on navigable waters. The location they're challenging is 120 miles away by no argument from the nearest thing that anybody would truly consider a navigable water. The Farm Bureau in Missouri has a map that I brought to the floor now a number of times. In the Farm Bureau map of where the jurisdiction of the EPA would be under waters of the United States. This is anything, Mr. President, that deals with water. A building permit, runoff from your driveway, resurfacing a parking lot, fertilizer on a farm field, drilling a hole for a utility pole, anything that involves water, theoretically, under this rule, could come under the jurisdiction of the EPA. And in our state, anything that would define, in my state, anything that would meet the EPA definition of what could be the definition of their new sense of waters of the United States covers 99.7% of the state. Now, Mr. Speaker, you're a little further from this map than I am. You may not be able to see the 24 red dots or so on the map, the 24 white dots rather, that would be clearly still under the jurisdiction of the state of Missouri, or under the jurisdiction of a county government, or under the jurisdiction of a city. That, Mr. President, would be 0.3%. And so Senator Hoeven, who has fought to not allow this rule to go forward, as I have since the day it was proposed, has once again proposed an amendment to this bill. We all get to vote on it. A majority of the Senate has shown its concern about this particular regulation, this outlandish regulation, enough that the Senate and the House have put a bill on the president's desk in the last few months that the president vetoed that said, don't go forward with this regulation. What this amendment says is no money can be spent to go forward with this regulation. I'd certainly encourage my colleagues to once again step up, as they are already on the record having been willing to do, to stop this regulation. This amendment, the way to stop this regulation, is to say that no money can be spent to move forward with this regulation that a majority of the Congress, Democrats and Republicans, organizations all over America, government at virtually every level, county governments, city governments, state governments, have said they don't want. The attorney generals of about half of the states have a case before the Supreme Court, but none of that seems to get through to the all-knowing EPA on this issue. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues today to once again step up and say, we want this stopped, and one way to stop it is not to have any money available to move forward with this outlandish rule. And I would yield the floor.